Back in the early 1990s, I acquired a job as a maintenance worker at a former prison. The prison was notorious for how badly it treated the inmates and had been shut down for the past 20 years, but now it had been reopened as a museum. One dark misty evening in October 1991, I drove along the road leading to the prison gates. The medieval castle-like building loomed over the road in the darkness. It was only my second night on the job, and would be my last. All visitors and staff had gone home, apart from one other guy, a security guard called Cliff, who sat in his room watching camera screens as I went around fixing and tidying up fixtures and fittings. It was a couple of hours into my shift. I was replacing a hinge on a cell door which had come away, when one of the ceiling lights began to flicker on and off. I stopped working on the hinge, got my step ladders and placed it under the flickering light, but as I stepped onto the ladder in front of me, a figure appeared from nowhere. A hooded sack was over his head, covering his face, and his hands were tied together in front of his body. I froze with fear as the figure slowly and silently walked by me. I turned carefully on the ladder and watched as the figure walked on down the corridor before disappearing into the darkness. Then all the lights in the corridor went out. I fumbled in the darkness for my torch on the floor. When I switched the torch on, I began to hear a quiet, eerie sound, like someone was shivering. I walked slowly along the corridor, following the path of my torchlight. Hello? Who's there? Something touched me lightly on the back of my head and I spun around quickly. I gasped with horror as the torchlight revealed a row of 5 or 6 men hung on the wall by chains. They were all shivering, frozen with frost and icicles hanging from their faces and bodies. Help me! I ran as fast as I could down the corridor, and as I did I could hear echoing voices and loud whispers. Through my unsteady torchlight, I could see glimpses of dark, shadowy figures darting across the walls. When I reached the end of the corridor, I fumbled for the keys in my pocket and placed the key in the lock. But just as I was about to turn it, I felt a strong hand grab my wrist. The grip was so strong that I could not move, and the horrible negative energy rushed through my body. Then after a few seconds the grip was gone, and the door slowly swung open. Despite the security cameras, nothing of the sort showed up on any footage, just me running through the dark corridor on my own sum. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. In the mid-1970s, me and my wife went to Scotland for our honeymoon. After staying in Edinburgh for a few days, we decided to travel further north into the Highlands, where we then caught a small ferry boat onto one of its remote islands. There wasn't much on the island, a small village with a local inn and chapel, but the scenery was breathtaking. We walked into the inn with our suitcases. It was full of people drinking and talking, but as we walked in, the room went eerily quiet. Every single person stared at us with suspicious expressions on their faces. We awkwardly made our way to the bar and asked if he had a room we could stay in for a couple of nights. At first, the innkeeper didn't answer. He just stared at us whilst clearing a beer glass with a cloth. Then he lifted a key from a hook on the wall and handed it to us. "Up the stairs, last door on the left," he said. Later that afternoon, after having a meal downstairs in the inn, we went for a walk. After about half an hour, we found ourselves down by a river, where we sat leaning against a tree for a while, admiring the view, when all of a sudden I saw a young girl splashing around in the river, calling out for help. "That girl's drowning," I said to my wife, and I ran and dived into the river, swimming as fast as I could towards her. But when I reached the spot where she was, she had vanished. I dived below trying to find her, but there was no sign of her, just a porcelain doll floating on the surface of the water. When we got back to the inn, we informed the innkeeper what had happened, and he used the telephone to ring round the village. "Well, I don't know what you saw," he said, "but it wasn't a child. All the children in the village have been accounted for, and you're the only visitors on the island we have at the moment. But I saw her plain as day, and what about this doll?" "Probably dropped in by accident, by some wee bairn. I'll keep it behind the bar till someone claims it." We spent the rest of the evening in our room, and during the night we were woken by a storm, with the wind blowing our window open and shut. After a few minutes listening to the knocking at the window, my wife got out of bed to close it, but as she reached the window, she let out a small scream. "What is it?" I said, rushing to her side. There, hanging and swinging above the window, outside in the pouring rain, was the porcelain doll I brought home from the river. When we went out later that morning, there was a strange feeling in the air. Everybody we saw seemed to be staring at us, and some of the children were running around laughing, wearing porcelain masks on their faces. We headed back down to the spot by the river, and hanging on the branches of the tree were dozens of porcelain dolls. "Don't worry," came the voice of an old woman behind us. "Nothing evil is at hand. Today is the day the island pays its respects to a little girl called Rosalind we lost in the river. She drowned with her favourite doll in her hand, so we hang these dolls up as a mark of respect." "I saw her," I said, "yesterday. I tried to save her." "But you couldn't have," said the old woman. "Rosalind died 50 years ago." With that the old woman walked away, and in the distance I could hear the laughter of a young girl splashing about in the river. One stormy, dark evening, me and my wife were driving along a deserted country road on our way back home from visiting friends on the south coast of England. The rain was coming down fast and heavy, when all of a sudden a figure of a man appeared in front of the car. I slammed the brakes on hard. Then the man, who appeared to be dressed in an Air Force uniform, came to the door. When I wound down the window, he asked if he could hitch a lift to an address about a mile from where we were. We said yes, and he climbed in the back seat of the car. Apart from telling us his name, which was Harry Johnson, he didn't talk much. Despite us trying to make conversation, he just stared vacantly out the window. When we reached the address, which was a cottage sat all by itself, we turned to find Harry was no longer there, as if he had vanished into thin air. Bewildered by his disappearance, we decided to knock on the door of the cottage. An elderly woman opened the door. We told her of our bizarre experience and asked if she knew somebody in the Royal Air Force. She said she didn't, but that during the Second World War her son served in the Air Force, but was tragically killed when the plane he was in was shot down. We told her how sorry we were to hear that, and asked what her son's name was. She answered, Harry. Harry Johnson.